Welcome to B2B Craftworks, a podcast about business writing. Good morning, business writers. Have you ever heard about branded original research? Because you have definitely read it. Anytime a brand has lured you onto their website with a cool statistic or interesting information, you have been pulled in by the allure of something that is original and interesting and based on research. So there have been funny B2C ones, like the 5 kinds of Netflix cheaters. But in this episode, we get to talk to Michele Linn from Mantis Research about the kind of survey-based research that B2B brands are doing as part of a marketing campaign to draw interest from B2B buyers. Michele, the first thing I want to hear from you as someone with a lot of experience writing branded original research is your honest opinion on what the best thing and the worst thing is about writing B2B research.
Yeah, so there's so much good and so much bad about research. Andy Crestodina, if you know Andy, if you don't, check him out. But he has this wonderful quote, and I'm paraphrasing. But he says, original research gets 100 times the results of a traditional article, but it takes 10 times the effort. So the great thing about research is that it works. I can't find anything else that works as well as research in this day and age for B2B marketing. And for writing. So that's what I love about it. And honestly, from a personal perspective, I've done a lot of writing and editing in my life. I love research because I can only spend so many hours of my day writing. Like I only have so much headspace for that. And maybe I am unique in that, but I love that research helps me use my brain in different ways. So I feel like it kind of breaks up my tasks a bit. And I can do a lot of different things. It's like putting together this really fun puzzle. So I think it's just really fun and exciting work.
That is so true.
Yeah.
And that never really occurred to me why, I think from a freelance perspective, why it was so easy to scale income at a certain point, because it was like I was expanding my capacity because you have that research time and thinking time instead of just pure writing.
Yes.
Never would have thought of that.
And I have editors who love working with us and writers who love working with us because they do get to like do different tasks and like sitting down and writing. So I feel the exact same way. So if you're interested, if your mind has that mindset, I think it's going to be a great project.
Perfect. And I think we'll talk about, how to get more comfortable with that mindset and getting to the point where you think that maybe this is something you can do, even if up to now you've only done the writing side of things.
Yes.
So to warm up a little bit, could you tell us about some of your experience with branded original research or projects that really stand out as your favorite?
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, I'm going to go back to the previous question for 1 second. Do you want to talk about the bad of research, just so it doesn't seem all rainbows? And oh no, it's fine. So the one thing about research is that it is time consuming. It takes a lot of commitment on your part, a lot of commitment on the client's part. So everyone needs to have that same mindset going in. And I think it's a new muscle for a lot of writers and marketers. So there can be a lot in the learning process that just takes some time. So, but I think if you have the hunger and the interest, I think it can be great projects.
Absolutely. And I'd say it takes that confidence and maybe a little character too, to be able to step up to a topic and say, I can function, as 25% of the expert in this situation, leaving room for real analysts and data scientists.
Absolutely.
But to step up and own a subject is something for a new writer that could be really intimidating, or a lot of imposter syndrome about who am I to look at this data or even write a survey question for people who know more than I do.
Absolutely.
So some of your experience, maybe what were those moments for you?
Yeah, so I used to work for an organization called Content Marketing Institute. And I was actually the first person their founder, Joe Polizzi, hired back in 2010. So my job which was awesome. So my job was to, do a lot of the editorial, get guest writers. Like I was like the writer, editor, jack of all trades when it came to editorial. But one of the things that Joe had the foresight to do back in 2010 is he partnered with marketing profs to create their first annual State of Content Marketing. It's content marketing budgets, benchmarks, and trends. So I was lucky enough to get to work on that project back in 2010. We repeated that project every year since. They now have a wonderful, wonderful research director, Lisa Merton-Beets, who runs that whole program. But that was always one of my favorite programs to work on when I was at CMI. and and obviously we tried to figure out what worked and what didn't, and research always worked really, really well. So when I left CMI in 2017, I was trying to figure out, where can I make the most impact? What can I and do work that I actually enjoy? So this was just a really natural fit to do that.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I was probably one of the people that worked really well for it, because that's one of the first things I found and started referencing all the time when I was writing for B2B marketing. So
It,
it works in so many different ways, because you
it
can
does.
write it and also reference it.
And for what it's worth, so many people I talk to, I mentioned, oh, I work for CMI. They're like, oh, you're the group that does that research.
Ah.
So, I mean, it's so funny that you say that, but I've had so many conversations where I think people found CMI because of that. And granted, they've been doing it for almost 10 years now, but even in year one, it can work really, really well.
I love it. So like we said, we're talking about research writers can help B2B brands write as part of a marketing campaign. So setting up kind of a more firm definition is going to be helpful for the rest of the conversation. Because typically this is going to be survey based. So taking a survey of an owned audience, like an email list, or a paid panel like from SurveyMonkey. But I know you've done other kinds of research that mines public data or even internal data, which is also going to work really well. But once you go down that rabbit hole of the types of research, you end up staring at people who are in a capital R research position, like a data analyst, data scientist. So the first thing that I think would be really helpful to answer is how to find that line between what a new or even established B2B writer could write and what you need to call in a data scientist or an analyst to do. Do you have a sense of how to find that line, or how do you approach that?
Yeah, I mean, the writer is hugely important. The data scientist is hugely important, but I actually think you need to back it up further. And you really need to start with the actual strategy. So, and a lot of times that comes from the marketing team, at least from my experience, that comes from the marketing team. And I know a lot of writers, work with the marketing teams in their work. So if you can find a team that wants to do research, they really need to understand why they're going to make this investment instead of doing something else. One question I love to ask at the beginning of any project is, how do you want someone to think differently as the result of reading your research? And I think that starts to get you in the mindset of how you want this research to really impact your audience. And then ask, what do you want someone to do after they read your research? Do you want them to subscribe, or do you want them, what does that look like? So I think you really have to take that step back first and understand the why of the research before you even, connect with that data scientist and so forth. And from my perspective, the earlier that we can get the writer involved in the process is always better, because I think that the writer, has more context and can write smarter insights when they're involved instead of just getting handed this pile of data. But I would definitely, like I said, back up first.
Yeah, and I wonder how much of this might be us taking for granted that a B2B writer is going to niche at some point or pretty early on. So you said, that they would have the context or the knowledge about the B2B buyer or the reader. I think a lot of that is going to come from, once you've chosen kind of a specialty for writing, you're going to understand a lot more about that audience and their motivations and what questions to ask. And that's kind of part of what you're going to bring to it as a lowercase a analyst in the situation. So I think a lot of the ones I've done have been, the analysis really does fall on the writer to do with the help of subject matter experts, but not with an actual data scientist or analyst, partnered with the project. So that could be a difference between the ones, the more mature ones that you've done, and the more like marketing side ones that I've done.
And for what it's worth, I am not a data scientist, I'm not a data analyst, but we always work with the data people in the back end. Gotcha. Just to make sure that everything's really credible and valid as possible. But they honestly, at least from my experience, they haven't really gotten that involved in the actual process with the clients. But it's nice to have that person in the background when you do have those questions and you are trying to figure out how to ask something or analyze something and so forth.
Yeah. So I wonder if there's a spectrum, I'm going to draw a little rainbow, of more mature and maybe more sophisticated topics that require more of a science approach, analyst approach, and then more branded marketing side, not for fun because it's effective marketing, but more for conversation starters or interesting things people are doing, as opposed to things people might make really important business decisions based on. I don't know if that's coming across correctly, but
absolutely. I mean, and I think in marketing, and we'll be talking about this later, but I think that I am a huge believer in you need really valid, credible data. But I also don't think that we need to take ourselves so seriously. Like, I think there's this line of we can share useful insights that bring new meaning to our audience. I think that's really helpful.
yes.
And to me, I think that the data scientist comes into play to make sure that you have the processes in place, to make sure that you're cleaning the data, you're actually like taking all of those steps to make sure that the data that you have is accurate. And no matter where you are on that rainbow, you're going to need accurate data.
Perfect. Yeah. I love that because I'm thinking of projects where, I've referenced a report by a PhD in economics and his analysis, and that's very different from a report I did with a learning management system about how people are applying new types of learning methodologies. So
Absolutely.
one, I was able to act more as a subject matter expert because of my background in education. The other, I'm just going to quote the PhD because he knows what he's talking about. So maybe the pointer here is to go into that strategy conversation knowing what you bring to the table and what you don't, so that you're just honest about what they're getting.
And my experience too has, again, I'm not a stats person. I'm not a PhD at all in stats. We work with someone who is, but I think it's, if you can have the mindset that you know how to take data and you know how to turn it into a story, I think that's really helpful. And as long as there's someone on the back end to help make sure that that data is valid, that's all you really need. Like, you don't need to be jack of all trades when it comes to research. You just need to know where you get that help. And quite frankly, a lot of tools out there can help you with the data quality.
Yeah, and I was thinking that there's also, like you said, research firms that would really specialize in that part of it, of making sure you have the right methodologies or that you're taking the right insights out of something if it gets complex. So I know Paul Jarvis ran a survey for fun for him on privacy, and reached out to a firm. I think it was called Uncommon Good or something like that.
Okay.
If there's show notes, I'll put that in there, of people who really just do that part, who look at the data and help you with that side of it. So yeah, that makes sense. And I love the idea of the writer almost as Sherpa of the information, because you're taking it from someone with a really complex understanding of it and sharing it with people who might not have it, right? Like, the whole point is that you're trying to make it accessible and tell that story.
Yes.
So that's a role I think writers can step into confidently in this whole process of, where's the story and how can I help tell it? That's awesome.
Absolutely. Like, I have so many people who have said to us, like, oh my gosh, I'm so glad that you could make sense of this data and figure out what's meaningful from it. And it's one of those things, like, if you see it, you see it, but if you don't, it's really hard to make sense of it. And like, what do you actually do with it? Like, we had some marketer talk to us over the summer, and we did all of this research last summer, and it was a really niche audience. They had tons of respondents, and they were like, you know what, nothing interesting surfaced. So to bring that writer on from the beginning to kind of know what you have at the end, what you want to show in the end, that's really helpful.
Yes. And that's where confidence can come from, is the more you do that, the better you get at seeing stories in data, because you start to think about it from different angles, or bring the experience from a first project into your second project. So I think that's something that builds over time.
It absolutely does.
How cool. So from a writer's perspective, you hinted on this a little bit with the first question, but I think it would help to find out why a B2B brand would even want to do this, or why it should be on their list for 2020, whatever year it is. So whether you're a freelancer and you want to sell this to a client, or you're in-house and you want to bring an idea to your marketing director or content director, what would you say branded research achieves that makes it worth it?
So when we talk with marketers, a lot of marketers want to do one of four things. First, they want to get backlinks. They want to get website traffic. Obviously backlinks are a sign of authority. And so it's one, like you mentioned at the beginning, like if you stumble across a website because they are the source of data on XYZ topic, that's a really, really powerful thing. So if your goal is to get backlinks, you want to be that source that people cite instead of you going out and citing others. I mean, it's that simple. It works really, really well. And there's so many different use cases. If you look at different websites who publish research plus other content, typically their research has the most backlinks on their website. So it just works. The second thing that a lot of brands want to do is get media mentions, which obviously is a very special kind of backlink. And research can work really, really well for that, simply because, journalists are looking to cover something different. And if you can back that something different with data, that can work really well. And if this is new data, and there's an actual story behind it, again, that's where the writer comes in. Research works really well for those purposes. The third thing a lot of marketers want to do, I talk to, is they want to get brand awareness, or they want to be seen as a thought leader in their space. I know we are all, at least I've experienced this. There's so much content out there. You're thinking, what can I actually write that's different? What can I say that's actually new? How can I say something that's actually meaningful? And if you structure your research in a way where you are looking for those new insights in a really, with a bent on like curiosity and investigation, you are going to find things that are new, and you are going to find some things that are meaningful. So it's great for your marketplace. And quite frankly, it's just it's like soul, what's the word? Like it feels nice to your soul to actually say something different. It's cleansing. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So it works really well for that. And then the last thing I would say, a lot of companies want to use research for subscribers and for leads. And when you think about, research is something that you can absolutely gate. People will, give you their information for that. But the other thing, if you do survey-based research, is that you are going to have so many different insights and so many different data points and so many places where you can spin off stories. That research can be the cornerstone of all of your editorial or your email campaign, your email subscriptions, or your, lead nurturing. So it can work beautifully if you actually structure it well.
Yeah, and those are just like first level benefits, like the huge rocks that you put in the jar. Because once you have the research, I feel like from a content brainstorming perspective, every single statistic could be a series of articles of, why is that? Has it changed? How will it change? What influences are going into making this number change? And then compounding that over years as you get benchmarks like CMI has done, it just becomes this endless source of ideas that, like you said, are fresh and actually compelling. And the one that stands out most to me is the last one you mentioned, because that is such a real numbers thing that brands can get out of original research. Just having a real reason to email your list that isn't just, hey, come buy this thing. If you can actually share something and give them something of value that starts a conversation, even if that conversation doesn't that day end with them buying something. As a writer, you're now contributing directly to lead generation. And in B2B, that's the number one thing you'd put on your website. So it's like all these benefits just kind of keep cascading. And there is something just really pure about doing something for a client that you know for a fact is going to help something tangible. It's just one of the best feelings in the world if you're into business, knowing that you really help someone.
And one other thing just to mention, just to add to that too, is I feel like a lot of companies with research, even if they have awesome findings, where a lot of companies fall flat, is that they just don't do enough with their findings, because either they're burnt out or, the projects do take time. So by the time they're to the end, it's like, okay, let's move on to something else. Or this is just the way, marketing organizations work. They're just always moving so quickly. But if you have a writer who can actually write and digest and say, hey, let's create all of this additional content from this research, a lot of companies are open to doing that. They just don't either have the initial appetite or the know-how to do it. So writers, I think, can get a wealth of work just from all of that spin-off content.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think the way I've mainly done this has been to pair the survey process with a report and a webinar, and then you could easily tag on some blog posts there too. But that seems to be the original package that packs the punch. I think that gets someone started, and it's expensive enough that it's really valuable for a freelancer, if that's the way you're billing. But I think it's also cheap enough from the brand's perspective that you get this big body of work from this one project, and you have a sense that you've tried it, and you've really
Yes.
it's not just we have the data, now we'll sit on it another 6 months, but you're just coming out of the gate with a whole package of things that are ready to go. So that's awesome.
And I'd be happy to share in the slide notes too. Like I have this slide that I use depending on what your goal is. There's a lot of different opportunities that you can then prioritize on the back end. So for instance, like if your goal is backlinks, well, you might want to guest post on other websites, or you might want to do videos because that's going to point people to your website. But if your goal is lead gen, like webinars work great, or you might want to create, other gated content, or you might want to do assessments. So, the list goes on and on, but there's a lot of different things that marketers can do, and they can help, just like you said, be that Sherpa to their clients to help them really prioritize what are those things that are best to do for their particular use case.
Yeah, I love it. And I think, we get a lot of people from B2B companies in the Institute and probably listening to this. So I think that's probably another sweet rainbow spectrum of, what kind of help you need. If you already feel like you have a sense of how this works and you just want to test it, it might work to just go straight to a freelancer and have kind of a one-on-one project go on like that. If you have this sense that this could be a much bigger thing and you want it to align with a lot of other strategic things you're doing, then going with like a more sophisticated research firm, so to speak, like yours, is going to be better to have that strategy going into it and really be sure that all the pieces are very formalized and mature, if that makes sense. So again, from that perspective, it seems like there's a lot of ways to come into this and try it in a way that's going to work.
Yes. For what it's worth, I would recommend no matter where you are on that rainbow, that you obviously always have some kind of strategy. It doesn't need to be a deep strategy. It doesn't need to be overly complicated. But and a lot of our clients, we don't have to get so much into the weeds, but just knowing what that end goal is and level setting across all the different participants is always super, super helpful.
Perfect. And so speaking of helpful, I think it's going to give us a lot more to talk about if we walk through just a really simple view of what this process could look like. So mainly, if you're a writer for the first time thinking of trying this project. So what if we take a really simple example like a B2B webinar tool or a SaaS company that says, we want to try this original research thing. Where would you start and what would that process look like? Which is also in the free ebook on your website. So everybody should download that too.
So, basically to keep it simple, the first part is all around the strategy, which we've talked about, like why are you doing this and what impact do you want to make? I always want to make sure that, we also work with clients to choose the right topic and approach for research. We don't want the punchline to be buy our product because people see right through that. So sometimes some clients get that right away. Some clients that takes a little bit of education to really narrow down what that right topic is. But anyway, you start with all of the strategy. From there, you then move on to what we call data science. And that is, in very simple terms, putting together the survey, working with the client to get that, where it needs to be. It's a very collaborative, iterative process. Programming that survey on the right survey technology, testing that survey, and then putting that survey out into the field. So there's a lot of different ways to get responses, but going through that whole process. And then at the end of the data science process, what we do is we produce all of these different, we produce all of the data reports. We go through all of the different data. And then what I think is most important and what's most interesting for your group is really pulling out what are those key stories, what are those editorial themes, which again ties back to that strategy of how do you want to impact how someone's actually thinking differently because they read your research. So that's data science. That's a pretty big part of the project, obviously. And then once you have all of your data and the key themes, we then move into what we call research journalism, which is basically taking those findings and taking the data and turning it into research findings and putting together that launch plan for the research. And then after that, the last stage is amplification. So just like we talked about too, you have all of this great data. What else can you do with it beyond the initial findings?
Perfect.
So that's
Yeah.
kind of the process that we walk through. And it might obviously vary from writer to writer, but I think it's a good framework to make sure you have all of those pieces covered.
Yeah. And I wonder, so if we look at each stage and maybe think about some tools or things to keep in mind as you work through that.
Mm-hmm.
I love that you mentioned that making it more editorial instead of promotional. I think that's been a big theme in content marketing in the past 5 years or so. As everyone gets really, as buyers get really savvy to sales pitches, they're what's a appropriate way to say it? Their BS meter is very finely tuned.
Yes.
So if you lead in with a statistic that's like, 100% of people are using webinar tools, you can just smell that, and it's not going to be very compelling. And I think that is part of the strategy we've talked about in an example before is if you're polling an audience of your webinar tool customers, it's not really helpful to ask if they're using a webinar tool because you already know the answer to that question is yes. And anyone who sees that statistic is going to know it's really biased. So it's more about turning to that audience that you know is already using the webinar tool and saying, how are you using it? What does not work about what you have been doing? What have you added? What are you going to be buying this year to help you with your webinar tools? Suddenly you're looking at information that is by nature not promotional, but because you're the one talking about it, it promotes you in a really great way because that's what thought leadership is and where that comes from, is talking about important things that might not directly benefit you in the short run. So do you have any thoughts on how to educate a client who, maybe it's the marketing manager and they just keep repeating that phrase that needs to be in the research because that's their slogan, that kind of thing. How do you start that conversation?
So typically, I mean, we've had clients that, hey, our idea is to cover like how many people adopt webinars or do things like we want to like have all of these different stats. And by and large, most people who we educate and say, like you said, don't be that's very biased, but, explore things that matter to your audience. Like where are they challenged, or why are their peers using webinars, or, what can you find that's controversial about webinars, and how can you use the survey to explore where people think on certain issues? Most clients, by and large, all of our clients are like, oh, I can see.
Yeah.
It makes sense then that they should change that mindset. I mean, I've only had one client who was more, and it was a different situation, but they only wanted their data to say one particular thing. And quite frankly, we just didn't work with them anymore. I mean, so I mean, it's also, I think, just taking, if you can't, I'm a big believer in saying no to projects that don't fit what I'm trying to do. And I know that not everyone can do that, or different people have different philosophies about that. But if you can't educate your client enough to have them understand what you're trying to do, maybe they're not the right client for you.
Absolutely. And there's a very focused Q&A question on exactly that. So we'll be able to dig into that even more. Very cool. And then that actually is a really good segue to that question development phase. And like you're saying, to figure out what you want people to be able to, or figure out how you want people to change their behavior after they read the study. And so one thing I like to do is when I'm developing the questions is to create a graph, so to speak, with 3 columns where I'm identifying themes that we want to cover on the left column to make sure that you don't spend too many questions on any one theme, that kind of thing. Then the question is in the next column, and then in the far right, the question and the answers are in the next column. And in the far right, I'm showing the client what kind of data we might be able to get from this. So if I'm asking, which of the following webinar strategies are you using to develop leads? In that last column, it would say, as a result of this question, we'll be able to say a statistic like 87% of people are doing blank to get leads with webinars. And I find that gives a good conversation starter, again, of, is that information we want to know? Is that information that is going to be helpful or that we'll be able to build a bigger story on. And sometimes I find while I'm writing the question, I can tell it's not a good question because that result is not interesting. And sometimes that makes it to the client and they say, we're not really interested in that question. So it really helps cut and prune from what you're doing, because you also have to keep in mind you're paying for each question when you do a panel. So if you are limited to 5 questions, they've got to be 5 really good questions. So do you have any thoughts on the question development process, or maybe things you think about when you're doing that?
So I love that you have this rigor.
Yeah.
And I think that's a great structure. And I feel like writers and editors and marketers, we all love templates that we can start to plug information into. So I think that is super, super, I just love what you're doing there. And so if we do something similar, we don't have this template that you talk about, but maybe I'll borrow it someday and it comes from you. But the other thing that we talk about just as in a more high level is we talk about how your data can tell a story. So we talk about there's like 4 different ways that data can tell your story. So the first one is what we call find the stat. And this is a term that Andy Crestodina coined. But if you're trying to get backlinks, what are those things? What are those key pieces of information that your audience is looking for, and how can you be the source of that information so that people link to you? So if backlinking is one of your goals, and you want to be the source of authority in a certain area, try to figure out how you can have those really compelling stats that people need. So that's the first way. Another way you can tell a story is to kind of find the stat, thing on its head, and you can bust a myth. So I think this works really well if you're trying to get media mentions and you're trying to do something that's a little bit more provocative. So what are those things that people believe to be true that aren't? And how can you use your data to actually show that? So if your client starts thinking about that, like what are those myths in the industry, that can be a really compelling way to create a story from your data. The third way is what I call uncovering an opportunity. So to your point, like this was, for instance, when we did CMI, when we did our research projects there, one of the things we wanted to understand is like, what are the different things that people are doing within content marketing? And you would always find something like, wow, it's really surprising that only like X% of people are doing this. So whenever you can like uncover gaps with what people are doing or aren't doing and they should be, or are doing that they shouldn't be, your data can tell a really compelling story from that. And those kind of opportunities are really great sources of that spin-off content that we talked about that writers can take and then write about as part of lead generation and nurturing and so forth.
Yeah.
And then the fourth, construct we always think about is the last one is comparing segments. In B2C, a lot of times people will compare like, millennials do this and Gen X does this and baby boomers do this. So that can work. That doesn't really work that well in the B2B space. But what I do think works really well is you can, when you do your survey, you can figure out who are the people who are having success, or who are those people who are effective. And then you can like look and see what are those people doing differently than their peers. And telling that type of story works really, really well because people want to become more successful or more effective.
I totally noticed that in the most recent Content Marketing Institute. It was like the top 20% marketing firms. Like, what are they doing compared to their peers? So
exactly.
Cool. Yeah.
Yes. So a lot of times, I mean, quite frankly, those people are self-identified successful or effective, right. But you always find those trends. So I always recommend that you figure out what are those people that you want to be comparing, because those make for beautiful, beautiful stories.
And I also really like the theme here where each one of those things, it's like it's giving space for the writer to step in and help with marketing. And that's just from moving on. Again, I'm biased to the freelance path, but there's people who are in-house here too. But moving through your career and looking for places you can provide more value than just a word, being able to see what a sexy story is in B2B, like you said, provocative statistics, things that are missing. All of that is like a spidey sense that makes you so much more valuable as a writer. And then you're going to get better results with the people you're working with. And then just each engagement is going to get more and more profitable for you. And I think that works in-house in that that's how you grow your reputation as a really good writer on the marketing team or even in an agency, to have people almost literally beating down the door of your inbox to try to work with you or wait to work with you because you're going to help them with those 4 things and you know how to think about what you're writing. So that's just really practical and awesome.
And you know what, you're elevating yourself from like writer to Sherpa. I mean, anyone, and like, I know we probably, a lot of us feel this way, like the more we can help our clients make a difference and really produce better content and have more of an impact. I mean, that feels awesome.
Yeah.
So the more that we can learn and we can borrow those constructs, you know, like in the template from you, I think that's just going to make everyone's, they're going to be able to make a much higher contribution to their clients.
Yep. And when you make your marketing manager look good, you become their secret weapon that they're going to take with them just everywhere they move in their career. So it's really
exactly
just the ripple effect of being helpful is exponential.
Amazing.
Yeah, like an actual ripple.
Yeah.
Cool. And I'm trying to think the last few steps of the process, if I had any follow-up questions from that. But it seems very very logical that you're going to work through, you know, writing that report, maybe around structuring the report. I think the way I learned about that was just reading a lot of studies from, you know, McKinsey and Deloitte and all of these people that are kind of a gold standard in research. That's how I learned how to write an executive summary or how to format those trends and then what to do based on the trends. But do you have any format thoughts or how you intuit what a final report should look like?
So this is always one of those things where it just depends. But I think that a writer who can understand, like we always have like 3 models of reports that we share with clients. Like you could do this and it's good for this. So I feel like to your point, the more that you can read other people's research reports and the more insights that you can provide into how a research report can look, I think is a really good thing. I mean, you can go all the way down to the really simple report. We call that a content-light report, just for lack of a better term, but one that's really data heavy and says, you know, we have like an executive summary and our key takeaways, but then the rest of it is just going through all of the different data and some key highlights from the report. I mean, that can actually be really effective if you're trying to have all of these different spin-off stories and you're constantly pointing back to that report. And I think that can work really well. Or if you're partnering with another organization on your research and you don't want to go too far down the editorial path, because that can be painful because you guys both want to tell a little bit of different stories. You know, those types of findings can work really, really well. But other times, to your point, maybe you want to go with, you know, a more traditional route and have it be more, you know, context and text heavy and really like digging into the data and how it relates to all of the other industry trends out there. And, you know, there's a lot of value in that too. Or some clients want to have, you know, not just one big report, but they want to have this like series of like smaller reports. So there's a limitless way that you can present research, but the more that you can familiarize yourself with that and the more that you can share with the client and say, here's what I think is going to work with you and here's why. I think that's really key and it helps you find value with your clients.
Yeah.
So there's not really a solid answer, but it's just really understanding there's a lot of different options out there.
Yeah, and I agree. It seems like the default is it's a white paper, except now you get to reference your own research instead of outside sources. And then having those statistics really called out throughout with, for me in the document, this would just be text call out, and then you put the information and then the graphic designer decides how to make it look really good. But that, you know, if you have no approach right now, let that be your default approach. And then as you write more of these, you can pull in more suggestions for making it more creative. So totally.
Exactly. That's perfect.
Yeah. So I wonder, unless you had something to add, we could talk about some questions that came in, and then
absolutely.
that might be the end of our show. So the first one, we've touched on it a little bit, but it's about that editorial versus promotional angle. So Bethany writes, I'm a recovering data analyst myself, and these days I only write. I don't dig into the data like I used to because clients were always asking me to either skew or only tell one side of the true story that the research uncovered. So at first, I was able to use my killer creativity to deliver what the client wanted and honor the truth. But clients wearied of my compromise and directly asked for a more one-sided analysis. Um, so my question is, how do you deal with clients who want desperately and even pay desperately to reveal only research and conclusions that put them or their product in an unrealistically heroic light?
I love that question. And it's like it reveals the underbelly of research, and the thing that I personally hate. It just drives me crazy. I mean, I would say try to have those conversations at the outset of the project, so you know what you're getting into. You know, if writers can get involved in that strategy piece, I think that that's really helpful, so they can shape those questions in a way that you're not always trying to prove a certain answer, but you're just trying to say, you know, let's be curious and let's investigate XYZ. Now, I realize that's very Pollyanna of me, and I realize that doesn't always work out that way. But like we talked about, the other thing you can do is just give your client examples back of why it just looks bad. You know, like I was reading over the break, it was about asthma or something, and it was talked about, you know, the vitamin, it was talking about like how much you can benefit from taking vitamin D, says the Vitamin D Council. Well, of course, that's not remotely credible. You know what I mean? So your client doesn't want to be seen in that light, I wouldn't think. So if you can show them examples of how it just looks yucky, maybe they can start to see like, oh yeah, this isn't the right path for us. And I also just read something from Brian Dean at Backlinks, it was last week, and he talked about, this is a great quote that your writers can actually share, about how if your data isn't valid and it isn't credible, it actually can ruin the reputation of your brand. So let your clients know there, not only is there no upside, but there's actually a downside to trying to like turn the data and make it just about you.
Yeah.
And honestly, like I'm a big believer, if you can't make it work, that's not the client for you. So
I agree. Yeah. Well, I'm mainly distracted by your Pollyanna reference, because all I think about with that movie is that cow, where it showed like a minute of just the cow eating, and it was like, and it like zoomed in on the grass in its mouth. So that's not helpful.
I have never seen that movie.
Oh, make time for that.
Oh,
that's
okay.
That's a family classic. Yeah, I agree, and I love the idea, you know, that you're gonna encounter clients, marketing clients, who maybe are a little more cutthroat about what they want. But I think, like you said, if this is something you don't want to walk away from, for some reason you feel tied to it, either financially or because you like the brand, it's always worth, when someone's cutthroat about their brand, I think they really respond well to logic and learning more and how to be better, because they're cutthroat about being better. So to be able to show an example of, you know, why this would reflect poorly on you, or why it wouldn't really work for the client, maybe asking more questions about why they really want to see that stuff elsewhere, because you might find just things are always going on and it's never about you, like I think you said when we were first talking. So you might find there's internal changes where marketing is having to defend itself to sales with these taglines and just crazy things going on, where if you can solve that problem in a different way, maybe changing the title of the report or making the introduction more promotional, which doesn't really help because people will stop reading, but maybe make the conclusion a lot more promotional. But, you know, fill that need somewhere, but then let the data stand on its own. You might be able to navigate that a little better.
And quite frankly, remind your client that the data is what the data is, but then use it to tell spin-off stories. You can say, you know what, our data revealed this. And you know what, we were so surprised because, you know, what a missed opportunity, or, you know, we don't think that people are looking at this correctly, or whatever those things are. Don't hide from it. Use it as an opportunity to tell a really compelling story.
Love that. Yeah, because you're allowed to disagree with data, which sounds funny because you're disagreeing with facts, but it's just it's a poll of a segment, and so you can say like what you think is happening and show leadership that way. So that's
exactly
really, that's a
share
really
your
cool
insights.
Point.
Yeah, but don't change the data. The data is what the data is. But share your
like if Gartner released like, you know, 5 things top CEOs are wrong about, you know, it like shared CEO polls and they were like, no, they're wrong about this, and explain their reasoning, I would read that. I would study that.
Yeah.
Very cool. So the next couple of questions came from one person, and I think it starts with what, once you decide on a topic, how do you determine what questions are best to ask? And I think that might go a little hand in hand with when it comes to visualizing the data, how do you figure out which charts and graphs are best or which data to feature?
So, I mean, I feel like we talked a lot about story and how to figure out which questions to ask. I think your template helps a ton with that. Just thinking about those different constructs helps with that. And you also alluded to this too. Like I always create a, we call them dimensions, but it's basically like your table of contents. So what are those key topics you want to cover? So really put everything under those themes like you mentioned. But once you have all of that, and you want to figure out how you want to visualize your data, honestly, keep things simple. I mean, I'm a big fan. I think simplicity works well. You want to make sure that the person looking at that graph can actually understand what it is that you are trying to say. So if you make it too complicated, someone's not going to understand it. I think it's really good to use color. Like, let's say there's a certain segment of the, respondents that you want to call out, have a color in across your reporting that always makes that particular segment jump out so someone can tell what your key story is. Or even just you don't always have to visualize data with charts. You can say like 57% of people say, this. So keep it simple, but use color and use, techniques like that just to really help that data pop.
Yeah. And I would just add to find a really good graphic designer.
Yes.
So either your agency should have a graphic designer they work with, or your client has an internal graphic designer. If you're packaging and selling this whole thing by yourself as a mini agency, you can still find a freelance graphic designer who would be able to, maybe make a project great for designing a report, and then you outsource worrying about visualization to them because that's their area of expertise, and they're going to surprise you with really cool things.
I would say absolutely, but I would also just put a small caution in there, like, just like you do with looking at different research reports, just also look at different data viz as a writer, so that when you get the report back from the designer, I mean, I think it's great to have a really collaborative effort and make sure that the story is popping to you also.
Totally.
And just
Yeah.
as a minor note, when I work with, I'm not a graphic designer, but I work with graphic designers, obviously. We always have a couple of charts that we design from the outset, make sure that we like how they look. We get all those details done, and then we do the whole report.
Nice.
Sounds obvious, but don't ask the designer to do the whole report first, because then if you want to change something and he has to change it in 20 instances, it becomes a lot harder. And that friction,
right.
Yeah, it's a lot more friction.
Yeah, very nice. Yeah, and part of reading other research is you're going to start to see common visualizations and maybe be able to create. When you see the data, it might trigger something in you of what you've seen and how it's going to look good together. So,
and have that swipe file you just save everything to.
Yes, perfect. And I think as far as determining what questions are best to ask, if I were working through that webinar example, if we're asking webinar clients what kinds of webinars work for them, or what tools, what guests, what topics, it could really help to, in your brainstorming process, make like a mind map, or some of those tools where you can like have one idea and branch,
I love
and
those.
just get all your thoughts out on paper. Like, what could you ask? Take it from the perspective of the survey taker. What are they worried about? What are they trying to achieve? What mistakes might they have made? You just kind of change perspectives, and that should uncover a lot of things you could ask questions about. And then those themes let you narrow down what you're actually asking. So I think that's another reason this can be so intimidating, is when you take a topic that is just huge and you have to boil it down to 4 questions and 1 demographic question. And it's like, and get something that you could write a report out of. Like, that is really complicated and complex, but if you approach it in that systematic way and with good intentions, I think you'll be surprised with how it just comes together beautifully because of your natural instincts as a writer, I think.
And
At least
depending on
that's been
who,
my experience.
yeah, and depending on who you survey and what that mechanism look like, you might have room for additional questions.
Mm-hmm.
But to your point, short is always good because people only have so much mental bandwidth to go through surveys.
Right. Yeah, and the more you do, you'll kind of see that drop off of, we haven't really talked about audiences and how big a good survey is, but that might be
Yeah, I think that's
part
another,
two.
yeah, another day.
Next one. Perfect. So yeah, so trusting your instincts and kind of building those as you do these. And that might be the last question we were going to tackle. So, so this is where I don't feel as awkward thanking you a whole bunch, because I feel like we have just torn this topic apart in a really helpful way for people who haven't written one before. So thank you very much for your time and for coming. And Michele speaks at conferences all over the place, most notably Marketing Profs. Are you going to be there again this year if anybody's in San Francisco?
You know what, I'm going to submit to speak, so fingers crossed.
Okay, so we're hoping that might happen.
Okay.
And then, of course, mantisresearch.com, you have a really, really helpful, I printed it and I carry it with me, PDF on how to run a marketing survey research project. So that's going to be something that has a lot of tips, a lot of structure, things that are going to be helpful, both for B2B brands that might want to hire you guys and for writers who are getting started. So my closing question for you to send off all these fired up writers who are going to risk it all and try this project the next time they pitch something is, what would you say is the defining characteristic of a successful branded research project?
So I always tell people to focus on three things, and these are all things we've talked about today. But one, make sure that you have really valid, accurate data. Focus on data quality. If you don't have that, people can see right through it. Two, make sure that you have a really compelling story to tell from the data. If you just have great data but nothing to say about it, obviously it's going to fall very, very flat. And then three, have a plan for your findings. So what can you do beyond those original findings to really get the word out there? We didn't talk about this, but we do our own research about research, and we find that people do at least 6 things with their original research have the most success. So challenge yourself, challenge your clients to do at least 6 things.
How cool. Well, perfect. Thanks for listening, everybody, and keep thinking. We'll be back next month with another B2B Craftworks. And until then, you can find us anywhere you get too many social media updates, like Twitter, Facebook, or LinkedIn.